Hey folks, Doug Blake with Body Design University. Great to see everybody here for another Saturday lesson. Today we are going to be, we'll review just a tiny bit of the planar motion, but today we want to talk about the types of contractions that we deal with when we're talking about just straight resistance training. Okay, so is everybody ready to get started? Yes, yes. Miss Kate, how are you? Good to see you. And I know Steve is jumping on with us. Now, let me go ahead and I'm going to share my screen, guys. And if you do have your workbook with you, if you got your workbook in front of you, you can go ahead and just take a look as well. Now, remember, last week we spoke about planar motion, just real quick recap, talking about the different planes that we quote move our bodies through, right? So the idea is that we have the sagittal, frontal, transverse plane. Everybody was good with that, yes? Okay. And we have the terminology that goes along with that. So remember, from a purely testing perspective, you do have to memorize the what are known as kinesiological terminology: flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, plantar flexion, dorsiflexion. What else? Horizontal abduction, horizontal adduction. That one's a little bit more squirrely for most folks, but the idea is that if you understand those three planes of motion, you can describe movement. And that's kind of the idea. So any type of movements I do, I can describe them using that terminology because that's specific to the joint in question. And in resistance training, come on, what are we doing? It's not like we're throwing a baseball or anything like that. We're basically doing curls, we're doing squats, we're doing basic exercises that involve one or maybe two joints simultaneously to do these movements. So now we are going to move on to types of contractions. Now, this is, this is more in line with what we see in the quote, and I'll use that all the time, the real world. There are other types of contractions outside of the three that we talk about here. But we're not interested in those because those types of contractions are generally kind of used just in research to establish baselines for overall muscle tension, building capability, things like that. But the real world of training involves these three types of contractions. Okay, they're the concentric, eccentric, and isometric. And so we need to know this information because they are different, and the way that they affect the muscle strength, even muscle hypertrophy, is going to be, again, affected by the amount of time you spend in these contractions. And even from an injury perspective standpoint, the speed of a particular part of the contraction can be potentially dangerous or not so much so. But the first type of contraction that we talk about is known as the concentric. Now, in the gym, right, the health club parlance, we call that the what? The positive, right? So you talk about doing the positive and the negative, and that's great because that's the way we're going to talk to our clients anyway. I don't think I've ever used, well, I shouldn't say that, but I don't really use, terminology like this. I don't say, okay, come on, let's do the concentric. Nobody says that, right? This is the positive part of the movement, and then this would be the negative. So that's the way I would discuss this with clients. So we have the concentric, and the concentric referred to as the positive. And this is technically when the muscle, whatever muscle we're talking about skeletal muscles. I hope we're good with that, right? I'm not talking about your intestines or smooth muscle tissue. We're talking about skeletal muscle. When that muscle, a particular muscle, shortens under tension. Now, again, you're going to write this down. It's critical that you get both parts of this. The muscle shortens under tension. You've got to have that second part of the definition. Okay, the whole concept of a contraction is that the muscle is no longer at rest, it is under tension. And if you remember when we talked about the sarcomere in one of our first lessons, in understanding how we had what was known as cross bridging. You guys remember that? Right? So you had the actin and the myosin filaments, right? Myofilaments. The myosin is the central protein with multiple heads on either side that attaches to the actin. I don't want to get into the technical part of it at this point, but the generation of tension is because the protein myofilament myosin has the ability to essentially connect to through these heads on the protein molecule to actin filaments. The head can swivel, right? So we have tension development and the head can swivel and it pulls the actin filaments closer together to the center of the sarcomere. So, with all of that said, when we come back to the macro level, the understanding is that it's that sequencing of actin and myosin cross bridging that generates tension. Is everybody with me? So, muscles, look, guys, it's not much of a life, but somebody's got to do it. Muscles do one thing, they generate tension. And there's different ways that they can generate tension in either move and shortening. They can shorten, they can stay in place, or they can lengthen. So, this concept of tension generation is critical now to understand what we're talking about with a concentric contraction. So, the muscle is going to shorten under tension. Is everybody with me? So, when the muscle shortens, what does it do? Skeletal muscles attach to and over joints. And so, therefore, they cause movement, right? So, let's use the bicep as the classic sort of iconic muscle when we talk about this. So, the biceps originates in two areas up on the coracoid process and on the humerus itself. And so the bicep has these two originating heads, right? And then fuses into a single muscle belly and then inserts. You hear what I'm saying? Origin originates. And by the way, the origin of most muscles is generally that point of contact closer to the midline of the body. So the bicep, if I put my arm out here, the origin of the bicep is closer to the midline of my body. That's going to be these two guys here. Does that make sense? And so this is where the bicep originates, fuses into a single muscle belly, and then inserts. So the insertion is basically the distal aspect of where the muscle connects. So it inserts into the forearm, into the ulnar itself. Okay. And so, or excuse me, the radius. So it inserts into the radius, right? You got those two bones in the forearm. Yes, everybody remember ulnar, radius. So the bicep inserts into that. So origin of the muscle, insertion of the muscle. So what happens during a concentric contraction with the bicep? The bicep shortens, and when it shortens, it uses the elbow joint as a fulcrum and essentially causes this movement. We call it elbow flexion, right? Maybe I went a little overboard on the explanation, but the fact of the matter is that every skeletal muscle in your body that crosses over a joint or multiple joints, when it goes through a concentric contraction, is going to cause movement of a bone or body segment. And again, in the case of the biceps, it's going to shorten and therefore produce what's known as elbow flexion. Okay. And flexion is simply when the angle between two body segments decreases. Is everybody with me on this? So the concentric contraction is simply the muscle is under tension. Whatever is causing or whatever load is causing that tension is not what we're interested in talking about. It's just the fact that it's an actual level of tension that is generated. And then the muscle, the bicep in this case, is actually able to shorten and oppose that load. Got it? So if you read what I wrote here, shortening while it creates tension, joint movement is created, right? So the movement of the joint is created as the muscle in its process of shortening overcomes the resistance that's being imposed on it. Now, if you're not working out and you're just lifting things, then what is the load on the bicep, on the concentric tract? Well, it's simply the weight of the forearm and the hand and whatever whatever you're holding. So that's the load that's imposed, and the bicep in the concentric contraction is overcoming that and actually shortening. You all got that? The eccentric contraction, what we call the negative, is going to be essentially, from a movement perspective, the exact opposite of the concentric. If the concentric shortens, is the shortening of a muscle under tension, then the eccentric is going to be the lengthening of the muscle under tension. Now, it seems pretty simple, but actually it's really important that you understand the dynamic difference between a concentric and what's happening inside the muscle cells, inside the sarcomeres, from the concentric and what's happening in the eccentric. So normally what we say is that in an eccentric contraction, the stress or the load is already imposed on the, listen, shortened muscle. So everybody got that? So the load is already in place. So the muscle has been shortened. There is a load imposed on the muscle in a shortened position. The eccentric contraction now is going to kind of resist the lengthening of the muscle while it's under that imposed load. Does everybody get it? Just use barbell curls as a perfect example. I grab a 45-pound bar. I start with the bar down at my legs, and I curl it up, and that's a concentric, obviously. And then, with it already in this top position, now I'm going to perform the eccentric. And by doing that, I already have the 45-pound load is already being imposed. Now all I'm doing is I'm allowing gravity in this case to pull the weight down while I resist it from going down. Otherwise, I would just drop it. Has everybody got that? Okay. You're basically slowing down the lengthening of the muscle. And then, of course, you can go through a concentric end. Now, if we left it at that, you can deal with 99% of all the issues related to resistance training. However, there is another critically important component to the contraction cycle that we go through that is not only often missed, but is not properly utilized when it comes to resistance and, more importantly, strength and power training. Okay, and that's called the isometric contraction. And what is an isometric contraction? It's just does everybody know what iso means in Latin? It means same. So iso is same. Remember, what's an isosceles triangle? Right? An isosceles triangle, all the sides are the same, right? So isos or iso, and then metric is length. So the metric system is a sort of length-based system of measure. So same length. You got it? Concentric width, so the muscle shortens. Eccentric lengthening. Isometric, same length. So the muscle in an isometric contraction does not change length, but does what? Generates or maintains tension. Now think about it. Y'all are sitting down there, right? Doing nothing, maybe writing some stuff. Just let your arm hang for a second. Just my arm is just sitting on this table. My bicep is essentially relaxed, right? Does everybody see that? Okay. Is my bicep changing length right now? Everybody shake your head no. No, it's not changing length. Is that an isometric contraction? Go like this. No. Why is it not an isometric contraction? Because there's two parts to the terminology. Isometric contraction means that the muscle is the same length, but it has to be what? Under tension. Y'all get this? So if I asked every one of you to flex your bicep, right? Squeeze your, is that an isometric contraction? Everybody go like this. Yeah. So when you tense and flex a muscle, the muscle is now under tension, but it's not lengthening or shortening. It may sound almost sophomoric to say it this way, but the point is that the isometric contraction is a critical component in resistance training and the performance of exercises. Why? Because the isometric contraction represents that point in a movement, like in a repetition, right? Because that's what this always leads to. It represents that portion of the repetition where there is a changeover from the concentric contraction to the eccentric, and vice versa, from the eccentric to the concentric. You'll get this? So let's use a dumbbell curl. Again, we'll use a dumbbell curl as a great example. So I start with let's just say I got a dumbbell, and I start with the dumbbell down at my side, right? So my elbow is extended, and I'm going to begin this quote repetition. I perform a concentric contraction. What happens when I get to the top of the concentric contraction? Well, most people, they go so far up that they relax and the bicep isn't working anymore. And then they proceed back down through the eccentric where tension is developed again. And then they get to the bottom part of the movement. So you just did an up, stop, down, stop. Now, this is where the isometric contraction and its proper use in performance, exercise performance, comes into play. It is at the isometric contraction that we will generally have people pause before proceeding with the next part of the contraction. Dumbbell curl is a great example. And by the way, we see this all the time. Even top level athletes do this. They come up to the top of a barbell or a dumbbell curl, and what do? They just kind of rest or hold it up there. Or better yet, they will what? Squeeze at the top. Quote, squeeze at the top. What are they doing? What are they performing at the top part of that exercise? They're performing the isometric contraction, right? So in an exercise like a dumbbell curl or any bicep exercise for that matter in most cases, you can perform a concentric and there's tension development. But if you go up too far, if you go up too high, the biomechanics of the movement is going to cause the bicep to essentially relax. And now the weight just sits down onto your elbow, into your shoulder. Does that make sense? Trust me, there's actually a really important part of this that I'm going to explain to you in a second. Now, yeah, come up to that top. I squeeze at the top, whatever. And by the way, the squeeze at the top does like literally nothing. It's a waste of time. Yeah, but Doug, it builds my peak. Are you for real? Seriously? You actually think that? You might want to get educated because that's not what happens. So I know it feels, oh, Doug, I feel good. It's like squeezing your butt. I mean, you're doing a squat. What? Come on, guys. It's like it's a total waste of time. I got a better way of doing it, and I'm going to explain it to you. So now I do the eccentric. There's tension developed. The muscle is lengthening, so there's tension, right? And then I get to what would essentially be the bottom of the dumbbell curl. And what's going to happen? Before I change direction to do that next part of the repetition, what am I going to move into? I'm going to move into the isometric, what we call the isometric stretch position, meaning the muscle has been lengthened maximally, and now I stop and I pause. Question, of course, is how long do you pause? Well, do whatever you want. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. There's different ways to set up a programming, set up your programming to where you can pause, for a couple of seconds or have no pause at all. Here's the problem. You don't want to drop the weight. And so this is why if you're not aware that there's an isometric contraction, you might simply just drop the weight down and try and pull it back up. How many of y'all have seen this with any other exercise, by the way? You see it all the time. Okay, but if you are aware that there's 4 components to the exercise, it will make you a little bit more aware, right? And a little bit more cautious about how you perform repetitions. That's why the concept of these 3 parts of the contraction, that's why it's so critically important. Does that make sense to everybody? It's critically important because without an understanding of the isometric component, you might just want to do the 2 parts, the concentric and the eccentric, and just drop the weight down and get back up and drop it down and get back up, do a squat, drop down and jump back up. Does that make sense? So you could see where this would be problematic from an injury perspective, right? And so how do we then utilize this when we're doing our normal training? And that's where a little bit of understanding about the isometric can come into play. And I can do this for any exercise you want. Let's use a dumbbell curl again as a great example. Do I have tension on my biceps when the dumbbell is at the bottom position? I got my elbow bent a little bit, right? Is there tension? I'm holding a 20-pound dumbbell. I've got it right here. Of course, there's tension on it. Is there tension when I pull the dumbbell up to this position? Of course, there is. But what's going to happen as I move through the concentric and start getting to the point where I'm going to change direction? What's going to happen? The total amount of tension that's going to stay generated in the bicep does what? To the point where if I pull it up here, the dumbbell is being pulled by gravity. It's just pulling. There's no tension on my bicep unless I manually apply it, and that's the squeeze. Well, you don't need to do that. Instead, the more effective way to do the dumbbell curl is to what? Do the concentric, but only go up as far as what happens until you start to feel the tension release in the biceps. That's the end of the curl cycle on the concentric, folks. By the way, it's like this on every exercise. I used to train, and when I would be training people, I'd be training myself. I would have people come up and say, well, you just do partial range of motion. What do you think I said? After I told them to get out of my face. I would tell them, no, actually, this is full range of motion because the range of motion, based on this concept of the contractions, the range of motion is really determined by the muscle, not the skeletal system. See, if I leave it up to my skeletal system, I can move my hand all the way up here and go all the way down this way. Is that the way we do exercise? No, it's not effective, number one, and it's potentially very dangerous. So the isometric contraction gives us a little bit of pause to think, how do I maintain tension on the muscle at the top of the concentric and at the bottom of the eccentric? Is everybody with me on this? Give me a head shake, please. Okay. You only go up as far as is necessary to maintain tension. Y'all got that? It changes the dynamics of your exercise. And by the way, you will beat people up pretty good if instead of coming up and resting at the top, because that's what you're doing, no resting, folks, no resting. You come up just to the point where you still feel tension on the bicep. You could pause, by the way, at that if you wanted to. I don't think it's necessary, but then you go right into the eccentric. In other words, then you lower the arm down. What happens on a dumbbell curl when you get to the bottom? We're going to move from the eccentric into an isometric before we go through the concentric again, right? What do we do in the isometric contraction of just about any exercise or any movement that we do? What should we do? I have it in there at the very bottom, right? The application of the isometric contraction creates a what? A pause. You got to stop. Stop. Pause. If you're fit, you've been training for a while, maybe that pause is brief. You got such great control. You're not allowing the muscle to relax. You come down and it's just a slow transition into the isometric pause and then back up. Maybe that's how you do it. On the other hand, you might be training somebody and saying, you know what? They came in late. I'm going to have to teach them a lesson. You know what? I'm going to have you hold that bottom position for 3 seconds or whatever. That's not nice. Don't do that to people, but you could. So they come down and they hold it 1, 2, and they're like, oh my God. And then when they come up, guess what they want to do? What does your client want to do? Come on. You know darn well they want to come up and keep going and go, you don't let them. What do? You stop them. Does that make sense? And again, do this with any exercise, lateral raises, squats, you name it. You've got 4 components to your repetition. That's where that concept comes in. 4 components. There's always going to be a concentric and eccentric with tension development. There will always be at least one isometric component, either from the eccentric to the concentric or the concentric to the eccentric. At least one of them will provide significant levels of tension. It's generally, not always, generally going to be when the muscle has moved from the eccentric into that isometric before doing the concentric. Later on in the course, we'll talk a little bit more about why that is actually important from a performance perspective, because believe it or not, the goal is to put tension and stress on the muscle from the eccentric down to the isometric. The concentric and the concentric peak contraction at the top has little, very little effect on anything in the muscle. So we want to go where the bread and butter is, and we want to get to the bottom position. All right. And put tension, a lot of tension on the muscle at that point. Is everybody with me on this? Yes? Okay. Yeah, that's a lot to take in, isn't it? But look, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and just reach out to me, of course. As always, if you have not done so, please, please subscribe to the channel. Y'all have a great rest of the day, and we'll see you next week. Thanks. Good pause. Okay. Stay. Don't go anywhere. Don't go anywhere. All right. Any questions? You guys can come off mute. You guys can
Yes.
come off mute. Ask me. You got questions, Lisa?
You gave an example for the isometric for the bicep